President Trump is issuing an ominous warning ahead of a ruling that will determine whether he overstepped his authority in imposing tariffs. Trump argued in part of a longer social media
President
post
Donald
yesterday.
Trump is now facing one of the most serious tests of his second-term economic agenda, and it's coming from the courts. A federal ruling expected soon will decide whether he exceeded his authority in imposing some of the steepest tariffs in modern U.S. history. These duties, in some cases exceeding 50%, were justified under a national security emergency clause. But if judges rule that justification invalid, Trump could be forced to remove the largest tariffs and return tens of billions of dollars to importers. An outcome he warns could plunge America into another Great Depression.
Let's discuss all of this and more with Lydia DePillis. She covers the economy for the New York Times. Lydia, thank you so much for joining us. The administration just rolled out some of the steepest...
Trump's trade strategy, global scope. Trump's trade strategy has been built around aggressive tariff use. His latest wave is global in scope, targeting most goods from nearly every country. The White House says these measures protect American manufacturing, push foreign governments toward fairer deals, and, as Trump frequently claims, helped drive the stock market to record
leading
highs.
to catastrophic inflation or recession. But economists that we spoke with, they warned that this new escalation could actually work.
Criticism from economists and leaders. But economists and several world leaders, including Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, warn that such policies risk damaging supply chains and provoking retaliation.
How significant is this?
This is a major escalation of tariffs. It's across the board, across the entire world, on most goods, although there are large exceptions.
Legal basis, Section 232. At the center of the legal fight is Section 232, a U.S. trade law that allows tariffs on imports deemed a threat to national security. Historically, this applied narrowly to products like steel and aluminum. Trump's interpretation has been far broader, extending to entire categories of consumer goods. Critics argue that this stretches the law beyond recognition, making it vulnerable to being struck down.
Countries. As he noted, you mentioned some foreshadowing there. If his authority to impose these particular tariffs on national security emergency
consequences if Trump loses. If the court sides against Trump, the consequences would be significant. The administration would have to lift many of the highest tariffs, refund billions in collected duties, and lose a major tool in trade negotiations. Politically, such a ruling could weaken Trump's image as a tough negotiator, able to bend global markets to America's will.
There are tariffs that have already gone into effect, correctly noting that they have raised more than $100 billion.
Price increases, they did stock up on their major goods before many of these tariffs actually went into place, hoping that they would actually ultimately come off.
Short-term results. In economic terms, tariffs have brought in over $100 billion in revenue without triggering immediate inflation or recession, largely because companies stocked up before the duties began.
However, companies will have no choice. These are not something that they can absorb on an ongoing basis. And I think it's important to put into perspective what
long-term risks. But that buffer is temporary. Once inventories run low, higher import costs will inevitably raise prices, hitting consumers and slowing job growth.
Of federal income. That could rise to as much as 5%, but it is not going to replace large amounts of the federal government's tax and spending authority.
Even at maximum levels, tariffs represent only about 2 to 5% of federal revenue. That's tiny compared to roughly $7 trillion in annual federal spending.
But we're just going to add this 40% tariff on top of it. So on top of any penalties you might receive. So it's very confusing to importers, and it to me is emblematic of the seat of the pants way.
Policy unpredictability. Uncertainty is now a hallmark of the policy. A recent example is the new 40% penalty on transshipped goods, products routed through third countries to avoid tariffs, on top of existing legal penalties.
Goods that go into their final finished products. That's still hanging out there, along with tariffs on semiconductors, tariffs on pharmaceuticals.
Future escalation. Fears officials have hinted at more tariffs on critical imports like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. This unpredictability has made businesses hesitate to invest or commit to long-term supply contracts.
You mentioned some foreshadowing there. If his authority to impose these particular tariffs on national security emergency grounds is over.
Conclusion. The stakes in this court battle go far beyond legal technicalities. A win for Trump would solidify his power to reshape global trade unilaterally, likely encouraging even tougher measures. A loss could dismantle the core of his trade agenda, weaken U.S. bargaining power abroad, and force a rethink of America's economic strategy.
That won't be something that they couldn't have seen coming.
And Lydia, Trump and his economic advisors have celebrated the considerable higher tariffs that have already gone into effect, correctly noting that they have raised more than $100 billion in tax revenue. Recession. With economists that we spoke with, they warned that this new escalation could actually worsen inflation and
President Donald Trump's trade agenda has delivered a short-term windfall, over $100 billion in tariff revenue in the past year, but it's also creating mounting risks for the broader U.S. economy. Economists warn that if his aggressive tariff policies remain in place for an extended period, the result will likely be higher prices, slower job growth, and an unstable business environment. And with sudden new measures like an extra 40% penalty on trans-shipped goods, uncertainty is now one of the most consistent features of Trump's approach. The latest round of tariffs under Trump's leadership is among the most sweeping in modern American history. They cover most goods from nearly every country, with some rates exceeding 50%. Officially, the administration frames these measures as a way to protect domestic industries, force trading partners to make concessions, and bring new revenue into federal coffers. Trump often cites them as proof of his America First economic strength, linking the tariffs to record highs in the stock market and job creation. But the picture looks different when you step back from the headlines. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, is using the moment to diversify its trade relationships, especially with the European Union, reducing its exposure to U.S. market volatility. Carney's strategy is a reminder that America's trading partners are not standing still. They are actively adapting to the new trade landscape. In the short term, Trump can point to tangible results. Tariffs have brought in more than $100 billion in the last year without triggering immediate inflation or recession. The main reason is that many companies anticipated the duties and stockpiled imported goods before the higher rates took effect. This inventory cushion has delayed price increases for consumers. However, that buffer is temporary. Once inventories run low, businesses will have little choice but to pass the higher import costs onto consumers. This means more expensive goods on store shelves, higher costs for manufacturers, and pressure on household budgets. Economists predict this could lead to reduced consumer spending, the backbone of the U.S. economy, and slower job creation, especially in industries sensitive to price changes like retail, automotive, and technology. Even with record collections, tariffs remain a small part of the federal revenue picture. At most, they account for about 2 to 5% of total federal income, compared to roughly $7 trillion in annual government spending. That means they're no substitute for broader tax revenue. Their true impact lies not in balancing the budget, but in reshaping global trade flows and creating ripple effects across supply chains. The biggest challenge for businesses is not just the tariffs themselves, but the unpredictability with which they are introduced and enforced. A striking example came recently when the U.S. Trade Representative announced a new 40% penalty on so-called trans-shipped goods, imports rerouted through third countries to avoid tariffs. This penalty is in addition to existing criminal and financial punishments for the practice. For importers, the suddenness of this move, without clear notice or phased implementation, has been baffling and disruptive. Such unpredictability makes it nearly impossible for companies to plan. From sourcing and production schedules to pricing and investment decisions, uncertainty raises costs and discourages long-term commitments. Many businesses are now shifting supply chains, not necessarily toward U.S. producers, but to other countries less likely to be targeted by the next wave of tariffs. The risk of further escalation only adds to the unease. There are credible signals from within the administration that additional tariffs could target critical imports like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. These are not luxury goods. They're essential inputs for industries ranging from consumer electronics to healthcare. Tariffs here would ripple through the economy, raising costs for manufacturers and potentially undermining U.S. competitiveness in global markets. Supply chain adjustments take time and money, For some sectors, alternative suppliers simply don't exist in sufficient capacity. That means higher costs will have to be absorbed or passed along. Either way, the outcome is negative for business stability and consumer affordability. Meanwhile, U.S. trading partners are taking strategic countermeasures. Canada, led by Carney, is forging new trade agreements, building supply routes that bypass U.S. intermediaries, and increasing domestic production in key industries. The goal is clear: reduce dependence on the American market so that sudden changes in U.S. trade policy cause less disruption. In doing so, Canada also positions itself to attract investment from companies seeking a more predictable trade environment. Within the United States, Trump's policies are politically potent but economically contentious. His supporters see tariffs as a defense of American sovereignty and a tool to pressure foreign competitors into fairer deals. But the instability these policies create could alienate parts of the business community, especially if consumer prices start to rise sharply in the months ahead. Financial markets are also sensitive to sudden policy shifts. Even the rumor of new tariffs can trigger sell-offs or volatility in specific sectors. Investors generally prefer predictable, rule-based trade systems, and the perception that U.S. trade policy is being made on the fly can lead to hesitation in both domestic and foreign investment. The underlying question is one of strategic trade-offs. Does the leverage Trump gains over foreign governments outweigh the economic cost of uncertainty at home? For now, the administration appears committed to the pressure campaign, betting that trading partners will concede before domestic economic pain becomes too great. But history suggests that trade disputes can be protracted and their unintended consequences far-reaching. Ultimately, this is about more than tariffs and revenue. It's about the stability of the U.S. business environment and the confidence of global markets in America's role as a trading partner. A predictable, stable policy framework is one of the most powerful assets any economy can have. If that perception erodes, the cost may be felt not only in lost trade but in diminished influence on the global stage. As the situation develops, both supporters and critics of Trump's approach will be watching the same indicators: consumer prices, job growth, and the health of key industries. These metrics will determine whether the tariffs are remembered as a bold and necessary defense of American interests, or as a self-inflicted wound that undermined economic stability in pursuit of leverage abroad. One thing is certain: the impact of Trump's trade strategy will not be confined to Washington policy circles. It will be visible in everyday prices, in corporate hiring decisions, in the routes ships take to American ports, and in the strategic choices of allies like Canada, which are already preparing for a world where U.S. trade policy can change overnight.